had two neighbours. They lived on either side of him because he lived in a row of houses. If he'd lived in a flat, one could have been above, one could have been below, but he didn't, so they lived on either side of him. Neighbour on his left-hand side was Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd was a pine marten and worked at the sea. He was a fisherman. He'd lived there for about as long as Albert had lived in his house. And Albert had been in his house his whole life. Odd to think that as a mouse he could live next door to a pine marten, but the family seemed to have got on for years, so it worked all right. The neighbour on the other side was Mr. McAnally. He was a badger, and he was an engineer. He had recently moved in. He'd relocated from Glasgow, where he was born. So he had been next door to Albert for about 5 years, I think. So those were his two neighbours. Again, the badger, odd neighbour for a mouse. Both his neighbours would actually eat him if they got particularly hungry, but they hadn't done so far, so he held out hope that that would continue for a good while. Mostly they didn't eat him because Albert had a tactic. Albert didn't act like prey. If you act like prey, you'll become prey. So Albert projected large. In the morning, he would stride out into his garden forcefully. Mr. Pine Marten would be there, ready to go to the sea for the day. Albert would look at him and say, "Good morning," standing, looking very dapper with a hat. Albert normally wore hats, he liked hats. Mr. Hurd would be a bit taken aback. Albert was always quite forthright, so therefore Mr. Hurd didn't consider that he was prey. So they lived together, side by side, quite well. Albert's other neighbour, who was a badger, was called Mr. Can you remember? Mr. McAnally. And his job? He was an engineer. Albert initially hadn't got on very well with Mr. McAnally. It was all to do with size. The pine marten, Mr. Hurd, was a bit bigger than Albert. Mr. McAnally, as a badger, was a lot bigger. Albert was very small. In fact, Albert was about the size of one of Mr. McAnally's paws. So to project strength took a bit more. But when he saw Mr. McAnally coming back in his car, and Mr. McAnally drove a Volkswagen. He liked his Volkswagens, and it was blue. Mr. Hurd had a green pickup. The pickup was handy for the fish from the sea. So when he saw Mr. McAnally coming in his car, which was, what type of car did he have? A Volkswagen. And the colour? It was blue. When he saw the blue Volkswagen with Mr. McAnally coming up the road, Albert would make sure he was in the garden, tending his roses. Again, Albert liked roses, mostly yellow because that used to be his favourite colour before red when he was younger. He'd be tending his roses. Mr. McAnally would step out of his blue Volkswagen, walk up the path, and Albert, in the loudest voice he had, because it had to carry quite far, because Mr. McAnally was quite tall, "Good afternoon, and how are you?" Mr. McAnally stopped normally and had to look. He didn't have great eyesight. He would spot Albert on the path. "Very well, thank you, thank you. And yourself?" Albert would boom out as loud as he could, "I'm very well." Mr. McAnally would off into the house. So it had worked quite well. He kept an eye out for Mr. McAnally in his blue Volkswagen. And Mr. Hurd coming back from, what was his job again? He was a fisherman coming back from the sea in his green pickup, because the pickup was handy. They were both different ages, Mr. Hurd and Mr. McAnally. Mr. Hurd was the oldest, he was 50. Mr. McAnally was 40. Badgers don't live as long. Smaller animals seem to be long-lived. Bigger animals, not quite so much. Doesn't always work out that way. Turtles can live to 150 years, but really it would feel like a lot longer travelling that slow. But for them, it was a good life. Albert would always try to remember the birthdays He remembered them by a rhyme, but he forgot the rhyme often, so it didn't really help him very much. But Mr. Hard was the oldest, and he was, how old was he? 50. Mr. McAnally was 40. That was the difference, isn't it? They were good neighbours. Albert put a lot of work into being a good neighbour, and so far it had worked quite well.